Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show this evening. My name is Chef Andy, and today we are going to be working on a very simple recipe as always. Something that's going to be incorporating both dough and meat in one beautiful particular dish that you can actually use as an appetizer, and you can actually enjoy it as a very simple snack. We're going to be making some dough stuffed meatballs, and we're going to be starting the process, of course, by introducing the ingredients that we'll be working with to give you an idea of what to expect for the show. Now from the front, you're going to require about 1 teaspoon of yeast. You'll also require some cayenne pepper, about 1 teaspoon, 1 teaspoon of garlic powder. You'll also require about 1 tablespoon of some dried parsley, 1 teaspoon of some onion powder, a bit of oil that will aid you in cooking your mince. You'll also require your mincemeat, a bit of some sesame seeds just to garnish your buns with. You'll also require some garlic, a bit of some melted butter, which you'll be using to wash your bread before it goes in. You're also going to require a bit of some onions. About 2 medium-sized white onions will work for this recipe. You'll also require about 1 teaspoon of tomato paste, about 1 teaspoon of sugar, which will of course aid in catalyzing the yeast. You'll also require some flour for dusting and about 1 cup of flour for this recipe, some salt and some black peppercorns to season, a bit of some fresh coriander leaves, and last but not least, some lukewarm water, which you'll of course be using to make your dough with. But before we begin, we will of course take a very short commercial break, and we'll see you after a little bit. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who are just tuning in to the show this evening, we're going to be making some dough stuffed meatballs, and it's a very simple concept. It actually incorporates both making a bit of some bread dough, which will of course be stuffing with a bit of some meat, and we'll of course be baking this in the oven. So be sure to jot down, if you're taking notes for this particular recipe, that you will of course require the oven for this very simple recipe. Now of course, before we begin, of course we always start with the ingredients that will of course take the longest time, which of course means the dough. So we're going to start off this simple process by sifting our flour using a whisk, of course, a sieve rather. So be sure to start this process off in this very simple fashion. It always aids in getting any particular impurities out of your flour, and it also actually reassures you that your flour is nice and clean before you proceed to add any of your other ingredients. So once that's sifted through, proceed to set aside. Now next up, very importantly, remember you are going to take a bit of time, of course, to sponge your yeast. So this particular process is very simple. It actually entails adding a bit of some lukewarm or semi-hot water into your yeast. So we're going to add just a little bit of sugar to our yeast, and we'll add the rest to the dough. Proceed to add your water. And remember, the sponging process is very quick. You can actually be able to set that aside while you continue to work. It should take anywhere between 2 to 3 minutes to sponge up nice and easy. You can also, of course, use a spoon to just give that a quick mixture before allowing it to continue to sit on its side. Right, once that's mixed through, very, very simply, of course, very importantly, always remember to season your dough. So, pinch of salt. Right, once that's mixed through, you can of course use a whisk for this process, or you can actually use your fingers. But this is basically just incorporating the ingredients into your bowl, making sure they're nicely evenly distributed before you proceed to add your liquid. So mix that through for about a minute. Of course, this process gives you quite a bit of time to allow your yeast to sponge. Right, and once that's mixed through, very, very simply proceed to create a well in the center of your bowl. And by a well, we basically refer to that empty hollow that's right in the center. Remember, this will always aid in making it much easier for you to incorporate and fold all the ingredients in. So very, very simply, begin by adding about a tablespoon of some oil. Once that's done, proceed to add your yeast. At this stage, you will actually be able to see that it will, of course, look like a porridgey consistency. It will, of course, also form a bit of bubbles, giving you the go-ahead to proceed to mix it into your dough. And once that's mixed through, using your fingers, proceed to work your dough. Of course, at this stage, taking some time to combine those ingredients before adding any bit of liquid. Be sure to also turn your bowl around a few times. And this, of course, will resemble almost a crumbled consistency. Be sure to also use your fingertips to try and break down those big chunky lumps in your flour, looking for an almost consistent mixture. And once more, proceed to make a well in the center. This, of course, will take you to the next step of adding your liquid. So I'm going to add my water in very, very small amounts. Of course, it is, of course, recommended that you take your time to add very little water at a time. This, of course, will aid in making sure that you don't actually add too much at once, making you have to repeat the process from the beginning. So take your time to mix that through. It will, of course, be very, very runny at the beginning stages. And this is basically what you're looking for. So you should actually have it almost sticking to your hands at this stage. Begin, of course, once more to work your mixture back to the center of the bowl. And you can now begin to grab your flour once more and proceed to fold that through. Of course, always turning your board around. Incorporating the dough on the sides. So you should actually be able to clean out your bowl by doing this. You can also rub a bit of flour on the sides as you continue. This will, of course, aid in making sure that you don't actually lose out on any of your mixture. Proceed to add a bit more flour, making sure to work your edges. You can at this stage also proceed to add a bit of flour to the palm of your hands, and this will aid you in rubbing any bit of flour that's stuck to your fingertips. And this will, of course, make it much easier for you to work with the dough, and it, of course, limit you from working your way back and forth from the sink. And this, of course, is something I would discourage, because once you begin to rinse the dough or the flour in some running water, you will, of course, lose out on a bit of your dough. So be sure to always continue to work with your mixture without cleaning your hands for the beginning stages. And of course, be very, very sure to also add very, very little amounts of flour. So this kneading process should take you anywhere between 5 to 6 minutes. bringing your total time now to about 15 minutes for the preparation. And this is something you can of course be able to do way in advance. So if you're of course going to be serving this at dinner time, do take time to maybe start this process way early in advance. And this will of course also allow for you to let your dough to rise very, very easily and undisturbed. Right, now as we come towards the end of the process, you will of course get to this stage and you should be able to actually lift your bowl very simply from the bowl and move that onto a working surface where we'll need it very, very shortly. So begin the process by dumping some flour onto your working surface and move your dough out completely. By rubbing your fingertips on the sides of your bowl will also aid in getting that extra bit of dough out of your bowl. But be sure to reserve this. Don't take it into the wash yet. Very simply, dust your hands very lightly. Begin to work your dough, making sure to rub off any bit of your dough that is still stuck to your hands. Proceed to do so. Of course, always pulling from the sides and pushing in. Very, very simple technique of working dough. And of course, remember this stage is very, very vital. You will of course have to activate your gluten. And this is basically what enables you to bind and get that nice, beautiful dough. Right, now once that's beautifully consistent, rub off any bit of flour on your surface and basically try and press that onto your dough before proceeding to allow it to rest. And once more, very importantly, rub any excess dough off your fingertips at this stage. This will of course bring you to the last and final part of the first process of your dough preparation. And of course, as I mentioned, very important to not add too much flour at this stage. Remember, if your dough is too dry, it may actually make it very hard for you to get this to rise. So very simply reconstruct that into a small ball. Dust your bowl once more. Of course, this will aid in making sure that you can get your ball of dough very, very easily out of the bowl. Once that's done, proceed to place that in your bowl. And very, very importantly, remember, it's very, very crucial to actually cover this. So a very, very simple technique I can share with you is just grab a cloth. Any particular cotton cloth will do for this process. Be sure to dump it a little bit in some running water. Squeeze out any excess water as well. And once that is done, all you need to do now is proceed to cover that. And now you can actually now allow this to rise for anywhere between an hour to 2 hours. Be sure to also keep it in a nice warm environment. So remember, if you actually have an oven nearby, you can actually place that anywhere close to the oven. This should be the nicest, most warmest place you can raise your dough, or you can prove your dough. And of course, also something very important to mention, if you do have a prover in your house, it will also come in handy. But if you don't have one, any particular warm sections in your kitchen, on most days you may actually find that placing it over your refrigerator could be a little warmer, or anywhere close to your oven will also do just the same. And that we are going to allow to continue to rise very, very slowly undisturbed. And while we do so, just going to clean our working surface very quickly. And once done, you can turn your board around, giving you a nice clean surface. And of course, very importantly, proceed to rinse your hands before proceeding to do any of the other preparations. Right, so now we are going to start off the preparation of the filling. So it's a very, very simple process. Remember, we are not going to be particularly making raw meatballs to stuff into the dough because that may actually not cook through once it goes into the oven. So you will actually have to probably cook your meat at this stage and then allow it to cool before you proceed to stuff your dough into your, before you proceed to stuff your meat into your dough. So we're going to begin this process very simply by adding a bit of oil onto a pan. And of course, as you allow your pan to heat up, we're going to begin by chopping up some of our onion. So this we're going to be chopping up nice and fine. Remember, you will of course be using this to stuff, so you don't want to have any particular chunks of onion in there. So with a sharp knife, proceed to chop your onion nice and fine. So I'm using white onion for this recipe. It's a nice, beautiful alternative to using red onion. You can of course incorporate some leeks if you do have some, or some spring onions. They'll also bring a nice, beautiful fragrance and flavor. So as you work towards finishing off chopping of your onions, you can proceed now to add your onions into your pan. And now that we have quite a bit of onion in there, you can actually reserve that one piece. You can use it a little later on. Next up, of course, we're going to be incorporating the rest of our seasonings. So I'll begin by adding my garlic powder, my onion powder, and a small pinch of some cayenne pepper just to give it a bit of heat. We're also going to be incorporating to that a bit of garlic, but be sure to toss your onions as you proceed to do so. Cooking this at low heat preferably. Next up, in goes your garlic. So we're going to be using about 5 or 6 cloves. Right, so very simply, using the back of your knife, begin by crushing open your garlic cloves. This of course will make it much easier for you to remove the skin. So very, very quickly, while of course making sure that your onions are of course gently sizzling away, finish peeling your garlic cloves. Now also very important to mention, very important that you season your meat nicely at this stage. Remember, you will of course have this as a stuffing, so you of course don't want it to be very bland once you bite into it a little later once your dumplings are finished. Right, so once peeled, discard the skins. And I'm going to be using a very, very beautiful device. This you can of course be able to find locally. It's a very, very simple garlic crusher. So I'm going to proceed to just crush those into the pan, of course adding one at a time. You can of course also result in chopping your garlic if you don't have this tool available to you. So for that last and final piece, and once that's in, using your knife, proceed to scrape off a bit of that garlic that's still attached to your garlic presser. Right, so proceed to toss that in the pan. And once your onions are sweated out, proceed to add your mince. So for this recipe, I'm incorporating about 60 grams of some minced beef. You can of course also resort to use some chicken if you're of course not a big red meat fan. Proceed to mix that through in your pan. Of course, making sure that at this stage you will cook your meat until it's fully cooked. So just using a spoon, proceed to break down those beautiful chunks of your minced meat. So nice beautiful aroma coming through, not too much pepper to, of course, not make it too hot. For those of you who are going to be serving this to your kids, be sure to also omit the chili powder, if it will, of course, be hard for them to enjoy the dish. And of course, if you are a big fan of spices, then you can, of course, go really hard with your cayenne pepper. You can also incorporate some fresh chilies if you're really looking for that kick of heat. Right, now just finishing this off. Your meat should actually start to brown very evenly. You can, of course, turn your heat a little higher at this stage. It will actually help to rush the process. Very important to also mention, try and keep your mixture as dry as possible. Remember, if you add any particular liquid at this stage, it will, of course, proceed to drain into your dough, and will, of course, will end up with a very mushy consistency at the base. So be sure to keep the mixture as dry as possible. Of course, mixing through continuously aids for more even cooking. And of course, you will be sure that your meat will not also burn or overcolor at this stage. Right, so once your mince is almost halfway cooked, you can lower your temperature slightly. And we're going to proceed to add some of the rest of our ingredients, beginning with some fresh chopped coriander. So very quickly, chop that nice and coarse. So this should give you about 2 tablespoons of some chopped coriander leaves. Once that's chopped, proceed to incorporate that into your mince. Remember, the beautiful addition of some coriander leaves will give it a nice, beautiful, refreshing taste. It also aids in giving a nice, beautiful color. Proceed to also add about a teaspoon of your dried parsley. This will also give it a nice, beautiful fragrance. And last but not least, add your tomato paste. And now what this does is it incorporates and binds the flavors together. Also gives the meat a nice, beautiful, refreshing aroma. Of course, proceeding to cook at low heat. Of course, be sure to also move your mixture around the pan consistently. This will aid in making sure that you can incorporate all of the flavors very gently. Also be sure to keep a close eye on the tomato paste. Remember, this can actually cause a bit of indigestion if not properly cooked down. So you can, of course, add this by diluting it in some water if you're going to be making any particular sauces. But remember, if you're going to be frying or adding this to a fried mixture, be sure to consistently mix through. And of course, be sure to make sure that on completion, you don't actually have any particular lumps of your tomato paste still visible to the naked eye. Of course, coming to the last and final part of this process, once your meat is fully cooked, and of course you don't have any particular lumps still visible, proceed to add some salt to season. Crush in some black peppercorns as well. And you can, of course, turn the heat down completely as you mix that through. And you can begin to allow that to cool off before proceeding to stuff this into your dough. Right, now that brings us to the last and final part of this segment. We are of course going to take a very, very short break now, but when we do come back, we will of course proceed to roll out our dough. Where the means will of course have cooled down, and we will of course be also in a position to begin the process of assembly, and we'll also begin to bake. So I will of course mention once more at this stage, this process will of course entail a bit of other additions. So you will of course require a baking tray for this process, which I'll of course show you how to line in a little bit. And you will of course require a brush, which will of course aid you in spreading out a bit of butter very, very evenly. And remember, this will also aid in brushing up your dough before it goes into the oven. We'll of course take a very, very short commercial break now, but when you do come back, I will take you through the last and final process of making some very, very simple meat stuffed dumplings. See you in a little while. Welcome back, viewers. If you're just tuning in, you pretty much missed out on a little bit of what we started on today. But remember, you can be able to recap on this through our YouTube channel, that's BrandPlus TV Kenya, where you will also be able to see this and many more beautiful recipes you all can try at home. But for now, we will of course jump on to the next step. Remember, we had actually just finished making our filling. So I'm just going to move that into a bowl. The mixture is now fully cooled off. Remember, as I had mentioned, very important that you also make sure that your mixture is dry at this stage. Also very important to make sure that it's also cooled off beautifully before adding this to the dough, because it could actually alter the results of what you're making. Now, once that is done, we're going to proceed to prepare our baking sheet. So very important to mention, I've got a very, very beautiful tool here, a pizza cutter. Very, very handy, especially when you're dividing dough. And I've also got a brush which we're going to be using to prepare our baking tray. So to begin the process, dot your brush into the butter and proceed to brush it into the tin, making sure to give a nice beautiful coating. Remember, this is also going to aid in making sure that your bread or your buns don't stick to the baking sheet. It will also ensure that you get a nice, beautiful, even color at the bottom as well as at the top, giving it a nice, beautiful golden finish. Right, once that is done, proceed to set your tray aside. Remember, very, very important that by the time you begin to brush your sheet or brush your baking tray of your choice, very important to also mention that your oven should actually be preheated at this stage, because once you're done working with your dough, you will of course proceed to throw that into the oven directly. Right, now I'm just going to set that aside. And now coming back to the dough, it has of course doubled in size. So I'm just going to begin the process by moving it onto a working surface. Very important to begin by dusting with some flour, and be sure to also dust your hands as well, making it much easier to handle your dough. And pretty much once done, proceed to allow your dough to fall onto the working surface. And very simply, we're going to knock down our dough. This is basically just to aid in making sure that we don't have any air pockets whatsoever. Right, once that's done, we're going to begin to roll this out. So just proceed to reconstitute that into a nice, beautiful shape. And once that is done, we're going to begin by dividing that into about 4 equal pieces. So begin by slicing right through the center and divide those into 2 pieces each. Now remember, if you of course don't have a pizza cutter available to you, you can of course be able to use a regular knife. It should actually be able to give the same result. And of course, very importantly, I'm just going to grab a rolling pin. Now very importantly, before you always begin rolling, always rub a bit of flour onto your rolling pin as well. This will of course make it much easier for you to roll out your dough. And now all you need to do is reconstitute those into some nice beautiful shapes. Of course, at this stage, be always sure to try and get them to a nice even size. If of course it is a little tricky to do it by eye, with the naked eye, you can of course also incorporate the use of a weighing scale. That will also aid in making sure that the grammage is actually precise for each piece. But of course, if you're going to be working with some very, very small amounts, you don't really have to worry too much about it. You should actually be able to come up with some nice, beautiful, consistent sizes without even the use of a weighing scale. Right, so once done, just going to clean out the table very, very briefly. Once done, proceed to roll that onto the surface of your board, making sure, of course, to give a nice, beautiful dusting. And basically, you're looking for something almost a larger size of a biscuit. Shouldn't actually roll this too long. It should be very, very nice and quick. And as I said, the dough will, of course, be a little sticky at this stage. Be sure to give it a nice, beautiful dusting. But of course, take very, very keen precaution in making sure not to use too much flour. Right, now coming to the third, onto the fourth piece. Now for your last and final one. Right, simple as that. Right, now once that is done, we're going to begin the process of assembling our dumplings. So I'm going to begin by grabbing the first piece, tap it nice and flat over the surface of your working top, and proceed to scoop onto that about 2 tablespoons of your mixture. Of course, always making sure not to put too much and make it impossible, of course, for you to roll this over. And once that is done, we're going to proceed to grab about 4 corners of your dough. And pretty much all you need to do is, once your mixture is enclosed, we'll begin to just press on the other end, making sure, of course, to tighten the ball as you go through. And you can, of course, pinch out any excess. Reconstitute that into a ball once more, and you can proceed to put that on your baking sheet and proceed to do the same for the other pieces. Making sure, of course, to work as fast as possible. Right, repeat the process once more by lifting from the sides. Making sure, of course, that your mixture is always at the most center point of this process before you begin to assemble your dumplings. And once more, pinch off any excess. And of course, also very important to mention, always allow for a bit of spacing on any particular baking sheets that you're going to be using in the future. Remember, one particular thing that happens when this goes into the oven, it will of course cook and enlarge in size. So be sure to actually leave at least a whole inch to 2 inches in between each piece to make sure that they don't actually touch once they're in the oven. Repeat the process for the third piece. Once more, folding from the edges. into 4 equal corners. Reconstitute that once more. And of course, the idea of pinching off any excess of your dough is of course to make sure that you get a nice even consistency right through. And of course, as you move to the last and final piece, in goes your mince. And you can of course be able to store this or freeze it, and maybe if you're going to be doing this maybe on a few or 2 or 3 other times in the same week, you can of course be able to freeze your mixture and you can be able to reuse it anytime you need to. So once more, pinching from the edges. Give it a nice beautiful tuck. Of course, always making sure not to stress your dough by pulling it at this stage. By easily pressing it off the top, you should actually be able to reconstitute that very, very simply. And it will allow for you to get any excess dough out without any pressure whatsoever. Dust your hands once more. Alright, once those are done, onto your working surface, onto your baking sheet, you will proceed to brush those over with a little bit of your melted butter once more, making sure to be as gentle as possible, not to stress your dough at this stage. Be sure to go around each piece, giving a nice, beautiful, even brush. Remember, if you don't have one of this as well, you can actually use a bit of some serviette. You can be able to fold that very simply and you'll be able to brush over without any stress whatsoever. So of course, always begin with the sides, going around in one circular motion. Repeat the process once more after you've gone through once, and always finish off at the top. I find this technique very, very easy to keep the consistency right. And it also aids in making sure that you don't have any excess butter dripping all over the surface of your baking sheet. Right, onto the last and final piece. Once more, going around very, very gently, finishing off at the top. Nice and easy. And of course, once you're done, very, very simple garnish. Of course, this will aid in giving it a nice, beautiful appearance once it's done baking. Proceed to sprinkle over some sesame seeds. Remember, this is only for appearance. You can, of course, be able to find different alternatives such as poppy seeds that will also give it a nice, beautiful touch of black topping. And of course, as well, once these come out of the oven, they will of course also brown very, very lightly over the top, giving it a nice, beautiful golden finish all round. Be sure to also not add too much at one point. Be sure to go around your dough before proceeding to add that to the oven. So we're of course going to be baking this at between 180 to 190 degrees. It should take anywhere between 6 to 8 minutes to begin browning and about 10 minutes for the full cooking process. So I'm just going to slide that in there. Of course, as I had mentioned a little earlier, very important to make sure that your oven is preheated. This will of course aid in making sure that once your dough goes into the oven, the process of cooking will gradually begin without any particular delays. But of course, we are going to take another break now. When I do come back, we will of course be able to take those out and we'll proceed to the last and final part of plating. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Hello viewers and welcome back. If you're just tuning in, you probably missed out on so much that we've done today, but we're of course going to jump straight into the plating. So I'm going to begin by taking this out of the oven. And always be sure to have somewhere that your hot pan or your baking sheet can actually sit on well. Remember, very, very important that while you actually enjoy making these beautiful savories at home, you also don't proceed to damage your kitchen countertops or even surfaces that you work on. So always be sure to have either a space such as this, maybe place them over your gas burner, or even if you can get, maybe pull out the wire rack out of your oven as well. Also gives a nice beautiful base for you to be able to cool your beautiful work that you've been working on. Now we're of course going to jump straight onto the plating. So I'm just going to proceed to move those onto a plate. So as you can see, a nice beautiful color coming through there. Very, very easy recipe, as I mentioned, something but most of you should actually be able to pull off very, very easily. As I said, most of the particular areas that you need to pay attention to mostly are the resting periods. So always be sure to allow your dough to rest before working through each particular stage. Another thing as well, be sure to always make sure that your filling is also not too watery or does not have any particular fluids in it, because this can actually seep right through your dough and it will of course give a very, very different result altogether. But I'm of course going to slice one piece just to be able to show you what it looks like on the inside. So remember, since as this is particularly hot at this stage, I would not recommend you to serve them directly. Always allow any particular baked products or any pastries to cool off before you proceed to cut or slice them and serve them to your guests. Right, so very simply, of course, always very, very handy to have a bread knife around, especially if you're going to be slicing any particular doughs that are baked or any breads. And I'm just going to place those on the plate for you to just have a nice beautiful glimpse at what your dumplings should look like at the end. And this of course brings us to the last and final part of the show, unfortunately. I will of course bid you farewell at this stage, thanking you very much once again for tuning in this far. Remember, I'm always very keen to hear back from you, so do take this time as well to always remember you can always air your views to this show through our Facebook page, that's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And any particular questions, queries or suggestions are always more than welcome here at BrandPlus TV. So for this, I will wish you a very, very beautiful evening, God's blessings, and until the next episode, do have a lovely evening and see you soon.